I am fascinated by the mystery around Gene Hackman's death. It is a tragic, tragic death.
Gene Hackman's autopsy report just dropped, and what it reveals is downright chilling. What should have been a simple case took a turn no one expected. No forced entry, no clear cause of death, just a string of bizarre and unsettling details that make one thing clear: this wasn't just old age, and when forensic experts took a closer look, they found something far more disturbing than anyone was prepared for. The cause of death for Mr. Gene Hackman, aged 95 years, is hypertensive and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease with Alzheimer's disease as a significant contributory factor. Was Gene Hackman's death more than it seemed, and could the truth have been covered up? Stay with us, because this story is only getting darker. Without any further delay, let's get straight into the video. Thursday, February 2nd. 7. A mysterious discovery. Investigators say she died of natural causes. Based on the circumstances, it is reasonable to conclude that Miss Hackman passed away. First, before we reveal to you the shocking new details that the most recent autopsy showed, we must take this story from the beginning. It started with silence, not the peaceful kind that comes with a quiet afternoon or a lazy evening, but a silence that lasted too long, the kind that made people uneasy. At first, no one thought much of it. Gene Hackman, at 95, had been living a private life for years. His wife, Betsy Arakawa, shared his preference for solitude. They weren't the type to host visitors or seek attention, but there was always some sign of life: grocery runs and occasional phone call movement in and out of their Santa Fe home. This time, though, nothing. No one had seen or heard from them in weeks. Calls went straight to voicemail. Text messages sat unread. A neighbor noticed their mail piling up, something that had never happened before. And then there was the newspaper, an old edition, still sitting at their doorstep, as if time had stopped. Inside that house, something wasn't right at first. Friends tried to convince themselves it was nothing. Maybe Hackman had fallen ill and was recovering in bed. Maybe Betsy had taken him to the hospital. Maybe they had simply left town without telling anyone. After all, they were intensely private. But as the days stretched on, the concern grew. Someone had to check, and that's when the first unsettling detail appeared. A maintenance worker arrived at the property, expecting to knock on the door and hear Hackman's familiar voice calling out, or at the very least hear Betsy tell them everything was fine. But as they approached the house, something stopped them cold. The front door was open, not wide open, but slightly ajar, just enough to suggest someone had either left in a hurry or never finished leaving. That was enough. Authorities were called. When officers arrived, they approached the situation cautiously. An elderly couple out of sight for weeks. There were a dozen explanations. Maybe a medical emergency, maybe an accident, but the moment they stepped inside, everything felt wrong. The air was heavy, thick, with the kind of stillness that only comes when time inside a house has stopped. No signs of life, no movement, no sound. Then they found him. Gene Hackman lay lifeless in the foyer. He had been there for some time. His body showed no immediate signs of injury, no blood, no bruising, nothing obvious, but something about the way he was positioned felt unnatural. Then they found Betsy. She wasn't near him. She was in a different part of the house, also still, also lifeless. Two deaths, same house, same time frame, and yet nothing about the scene made sense. There was no forced entry, no shattered glass, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest a struggle, but also no obvious cause, no visible trauma, no sign of a break-in, just two people gone. And then came the next problem: the timeline. They had been dead for days, maybe even Weeks Hackman's pacemaker data would later reveal that he had likely passed away 9 days before they were discovered. But what about Betsy? Had she died at the same time? Had she been alive in the house with his body? If so, why hadn't she called for help? Nothing made sense. And that was just the beginning. In autopsy was the only way to get answers. What had happened inside that house? Had it been a tragic accident, a sudden medical event, something else? Investigators didn't know it yet, but the case they had just walked into was about to become far more disturbing than anyone expected. The strange scene inside the house. The most officers stepped inside Gene Hackman's Santa Fe home. The stillness was suffocating. The air was heavy, unmoving, as if nothing had disturbed it for days. A house like this, a place that had once been lived in, full of movement and life, now felt abandoned, frozen in. Some bottles open, others closed. Investigators later determined that the medications included thyroid medication, Dilmuse for high blood pressure, and Tylenol. It was unclear if they had been taken as prescribed or if something else had happened. Had she dropped them in a moment of distress? Had they been spilled, or was it something else entirely? In another disturbing discovery, one of the 3 dogs, Xena, was found dead inside the house. The other 2, Bear and Nikki, were alive but weak and malnourished. This raised even more questions. What had happened to Xena? Had she died from starvation, illness, or something else? Why had the other 2 survived while she hadn't? Then there was the timeline problem. Investigators determined that Hackman had likely been dead for at least 9 days before anyone found him, based on data retrieved from his pacemaker, which recorded his last heartbeat on February 17th. But Betsy's time of death was much harder to determine. Had she died on the same day? Had she been alive in the house with his body for days? And if so, why hadn't she called for help? Adding to the mystery was the lack of any clear cause of death. At first glance, there were no signs of external trauma, no bruises, no cuts, no injuries that suggested an attack or struggle. Carbon monoxide poisoning was quickly ruled out, as no leaks were detected in the home. Authorities also found 2 mobile phones and a 2025 monthly planner. Both were taken for further examination, in hopes they might provide insight into the couple's final days. Were there messages, missed calls, any indication of what had happened inside the house? Despite the lack of obvious foul play, investigators weren't ruling anything out. The scene was too unusual. The open door, the pills, the dead dog, the pacemaker data, it all pointed to something strange, and the deeper they looked, the more unsettling the case became. The initial findings: the bodies of Gene Hackman and Bet Arakawa were taken to the New Mexico office of the medical investigator, where forensic pathologists began their examination. Given the couple's age, there was an expectation that natural causes might explain what had happened, but the more they examined the findings, the more difficult it became to reach a straightforward conclusion. The first major confirmation came from Hackman's pacemaker data, which provided an exact timestamp for when his heart had stopped: February 17, 2025. This was 9 days before his body was found. That meant he had been deceased for over a week before anyone noticed. His level of decomposition was consistent with that timeline, reinforcing that he had passed before Betsy. Betsy's time of death, however, was far less clear due to the advanced decomposition of both bodies. Investigators were unable to determine exactly when she had died. Given the timeline, it was possible she had lived for days after Hackman's death, but if that was the case, why hadn't she called for help the condition of their bodies. Complicated matters even further. Both had undergone what investigators described as partial mummification, which can occur in dry climates like New Mexico, where low humidity slows down decomposition. This made pinpointing an exact cause of death even more challenging. Toxicology tests were immediately ordered, looking for any signs of poisoning, overdose, or exposure to harmful substances. Given the presence of scattered medication near Betsy, investigators wanted to know if she had consumed an excessive amount of pills or if something else had been introduced into their systems. However, toxicology reports take weeks to complete, meaning authorities were left in limbo while waiting for more answers. Meanwhile, the initial report did confirm a few critical facts. Neither Hackman nor Betsy had suffered any external trauma. There were no bruises, no fractures, no signs of strangulation, and no evidence of defensive wounds. If there had been an altercation or foul play, it wasn't immediately apparent in their bodies. One of the most puzzling details was Hackman's overall health condition. Though he was 95, medical records indicated that he had no life-threatening illnesses at the time of his death. He had heart disease, which was typical for his age, but he wasn't in critical health. He had not been hospitalized recently, and there were no known emergencies leading up to his death. Betsy, at 65, was significantly younger and in good health. She had no history of major illnesses or conditions that would have explained an unexpected death. Investigators struggled to understand how both could have died within such a short time span without any clear external injuries, no immediate toxicology results, and no obvious cause of death. Investigators were left with more questions than answers. The findings so far confirmed only one thing: whatever had happened to Gone and Betsy, it was anything but ordinary. But that was just the beginning, because what they would find later changed everything. Before we get to that, let's return to the investigation. Investigators searched for clues, with the initial report providing few definitive answers. Investigators turned their focus to what was inside the house. If Hackman and Betsy hadn't been poisoned by carbon monoxide or suffering from an apparent medical crisis, then what had happened to them? The first thing authorities did was analyze their daily routines. Hackman had rarely left the house in recent years, but he was still independent. Despite his age, he was able to drive and manage small errands. Security footage from nearby businesses showed that he had last been seen 2 weeks before his death shopping at a local grocery store. He hadn't appeared frail or sick, just his usual quiet self. Betsy, on the other hand, was more active. She handled most of their household responsibilities, including finances, errands, and communication with doctors. Investigators checked phone records and found that her last known outgoing call had been made just days before Hackman's estimated time of death. After that, nothing: no texts, no calls, no signs that she had reached out for help. Inside the house, detectives combed through personal belongings for clues. They found a 2025 monthly planner on the kitchen counter, still open to February. Hackman and Betsy's handwriting filled the pages with appointments, notes, and reminders, but strangely the entries stopped abruptly. Everything was normal: doctor's visits, routine checkups, until the middle of the month, when all entries ceased. Investigators also found 2 cell phones in the home, both belonging to the couple. These were taken in for forensic analysis. Authorities needed to see if either phone contained recent messages, unanswered calls, or any sign of distress. One of the biggest mysteries remained if Betsy had been alive for days after Hackman's passing. Why hadn't she called for help as the forensic team continued to analyze the home? They found something else: a fully stocked kitchen with no signs of recent use. The refrigerator was full with fresh produce and groceries that hadn't been touched. There were no recent dirty dishes in the sink. The coffee machine, which Betsy was known to use every morning, hadn't been turned on in days. Investigators noted that it was highly unusual for two people living in a house to suddenly stop eating or drinking. This added to the growing suspicion that something had stopped their normal routine suddenly and completely. The condition of the house itself also raised questions. There was no forced entry. All windows and doors were locked except for the slightly open front door. Nothing appeared to be missing. Wallets, purses, valuable items were still inside. The home wasn't ransacked, and yet something felt off. Authorities also reviewed records of emergency calls to see if anyone in the neighborhood had reported suspicious activity near the home, but there was nothing. No signs of intruders, no unusual disturbances. It was as if whatever had happened inside the house had left no trace beyond the bodies themselves. Meanwhile, the couple's medical records were also under review. Hackman's health had been stable for a man in his 90s. Music. He had heart disease but had not been in any immediate danger. Betsy, at 65, had no serious health concerns. There was no reason to believe she would have suddenly passed away just days after her husband, and yet here they were with no clear explanation, no witnesses, and no apparent cause of death. Investigators had to look deeper. What had truly happened inside that house, and why did it seem like the answers were being buried under more questions? Was there a hidden threat? As investigators continued piecing together the final days of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa, they began considering less obvious dangers, something that might not leave clear evidence behind if the house wasn't broken into and there were no signs of violence. Was there something else that had caused their deaths? One of the first things authorities examined was the possibility of environmental toxic. While carbon monoxide had already been ruled out, investigators still checked for other harmful gases or airborne substances that could have affected the couple. Radon poisoning, mold exposure, and even hazardous chemicals were considered. Tests inside the home showed no significant levels of toxic. Hackman's estimated time of death, and nothing after. If she had survived him by days, why hadn't she reached out for help? Investigators now had a troubling puzzle. Nothing pointed to a clear cause of death. It wasn't a break-in, it wasn't a gas leak, it wasn't an obvious poisoning. They needed toxicology results, forensic analysis of the phones, and any new evidence to explain how both Hackman and Betsy had died in their home days apart without a clear reason. And yet, as much as they searched for logical answers, something about the case continued to feel deeply unsettling. Which brings us to the final report and shocking new evidence, the unthinkable. The final autopsy report was supposed to bring clarity. Instead, it only deepened the mystery. Gene Hackman had died in 9 days before his body was found. That much was certain, but what forensic pathologist uncovered in his report suggested something far more disturbing than a simple natural death. Gene Hackman's autopsy report are shocking new details. According to some sources close to the investigation, Gene's body showed signs of prolonged distress before death. His nails were damaged as if he had been clawing at something. His wrists and arms bore small bruises, subtle but unusual for a man who hadn't suffered a fall or External injury, there were also pressure. Marks on his skin, the kind that don't form from sleeping in one place but from something else. Something restrictive was gone. Hackman restrained. The revelation changed everything. Investigators had spent weeks trying to piece together an explanation, but none of them had accounted for this. If Hackman had been held down, unable to move, then this wasn't simply a case of an elderly couple dying under tragic circumstances. It was something worse. Toxicology results only added to the confusion. No lethal substances were found in Hackman's system. He hadn't been poisoned, nor had he overdosed on any medication, but his final moments suggested that he hadn't gone peacefully. This raised an even more chilling question: was he tortured, and if he was, by whom? The home had no signs of forced entry. The front door was ajar, but nothing suggested a violent struggle had taken place inside. Nothing had been stolen, and yet Hackman's body told a different story. It seemed as though he was tortured. Betsy's autopsy, while less revealing, didn't offer any real answers. There was no clear cause of death, no organ failure, no trauma, nothing. It was as if she had simply stopped living. But if Hackman had suffered before his death, then what had happened to her? Had she witnessed something so traumatic that it led to her own demise? Had she been forced to watch investigators scrambled to make sense of it? The open door, the pills, the dead dog, the heater, the untouched food, none of it fit together in a way that made sense. If someone had entered the house and restrained Hackman, then why leave without a trace? And more importantly, why? The final report left too many questions unanswered. Officially, Hackman's cause of death was listed as undetermined, but the word felt like a placeholder, a way of acknowledging that something didn't add up, even if no one could prove exactly what. Whispers of foul play circulated, but without definitive evidence. There was nothing to pursue, no suspects, no leads, just a legendary actor and his wife gone under circumstances that made no sense. Even now the mystery lingers. The case remains open, yet stalled. There are no new witnesses, no sudden confessions, just a series of detailed tales that, when placed together, paint a picture that no one wants to believe. Because if Gene Hackman was tortured before he died, then someone had been inside that house, and whoever they were, they left without a single trace. If Gene Hackman was restrained, if he suffered in his final moments, and if someone was there, who were they and why did they leave without a trace? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more. Till next time.